Okay, so we're continuing our comparison of the Gospels, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, which was the Olivet Discourse, to the seals of Revelation chapter 6. Now, by the way, this is not the study of Revelation chapter 6, so don't get excited that we're moving right through that. We're going to come back and revisit all that. Okay, so we had left off at Matthew 24, and we're now to verse 23. So just to kind of catch you up, we had seen this false Christs. We have seen wars and rumors of wars. We've seen famines. We've seen pestilences. We've seen people being betrayed and delivered to die. And now we're getting to this point where we see that oh my gosh, Christ is coming during this time of the Great Tribulation. So we've entered into this Great Tribulation. So in Matthew 24, verse 23 says, then, after the Great Tribulation, then during it, if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even to the west, that means everybody can see it, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. It's not going to be a mystery. Everyone's going to know. You're not going to have to wonder, is he here? Just like lightning flashes across the entire sky, it's apparent. And in verse 28, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Do you want to follow the crowds? Just like eagles go to the carcass, that's where you're going. You're finding death. Anybody tells you there's the Christ, don't go following him. You'll know when he's here. It ain't going to be a mystery. Mark 13, verse 21 through 23. And then if any man shall say to you, lo, here is Christ, or lo, he is there, believe him not. For false Christs and false prophets shall rise and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. So instead of going to Revelation 6 this time, and again, Luke 21 doesn't mention any of these things. Let's go to Revelation 13. Excuse me. He says, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. You know, some people say, look, the Antichrist isn't even in the book of Revelation. This is the second representation of him. It's very clear who this person is, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So Revelation 13, verse 11, skipping forward a few verses, because we've not only heard the Antichrist, but there's also going to be false prophets, right? So in verse 11, he says, and I beheld another beast. So this is different from the first, coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So, because of the troubles and the problems in this great tribulation, this devastating time, right? What will people be looking for? An out. We need a Messiah. We need someone to save us, right? And they're going to have an offer of a Messiah, but he's a false Messiah. Many will be deceived. Again, this isn't mentioned in Luke, and of course not in John. The Antichrist and his false prophet, they'll affect a whole bunch of people during the time of the tribulation. There's no question, right? And people, many of them, will turn to him as what they think is the last resort, as the only one who can save them from this horrible time that we're later going to discuss, called the Great Tribulation. But they don't realize who is the actual last resort. Who's the only resort? Jesus Christ, right? The true King, Jesus Christ. So when Jesus returns, you're not going to need to travel to find him. You're not going to need to wonder where he is. Now, during the millennial kingdom, yes, he will dwell and reign from Jerusalem, from New Jerusalem, right? But at this time, you're going to know when he comes down. It's going to be as obvious as lightning lighting up the night sky. right? Everyone will know. So do not follow the crowds during this time. That will only lead you to death, because the crowds are going to be flocking to the Antichrist and to the false prophet. So let's take some notice that while Luke doesn't mention these events here, that is partially because it's mentioned elsewhere in Luke a few chapters earlier in a totally separate conversation. So even though it's not recorded in that conversation, it was recorded in Luke chapter 17, verse 20. He says, and when he, Jesus, was demanded of the Pharisees when the kingdom of God should come, he answered them and said, the kingdom of God cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, lo here or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. I'm going to pause here for a second. This particular verse has led a lot of people to conclude that there is no millennial kingdom because it's a spiritual kingdom dwelling within you, right? They don't believe it's going to be a literal physical kingdom. And Jesus is now reigning in our hearts. But as we discussed before, after the resurrection, the disciples still wanted to know, when are you going to set up your kingdom, right? And Jesus tells them, oh, it's going to come. It's not for you to know the date and the time, right? Indicating what? That there is a physical kingdom coming. So let's continue on through the context here and see whether Jesus intends to reign just in our hearts or also intends to reign physically on the planet, right? So he goes on in verse 22. And he said unto the disciples, now remember, Jesus just said, I'll be reigning in your hearts, right? But then he goes right after that. He said unto the disciples, the day will come when you shall desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you shall not see it. There's going to be a time period where I'm not here. Even though I'm in your hearts, I'm not here. And they shall say to you, see there or see here, go not after them, nor follow them. So his disciples are told that one day they're going to want to desire to see him, right? And they can't find him. People are going to try to convince them that he's back, but he's not back. You'll know when he's back. Why? Because everyone will know. Verse 24, for as the lightning that lighteneth out of one part under heaven shineth unto the other part under heaven, so shall also the Son of Man be in his day. So in the day of Jesus, the whole world will know he's back. But first, before that day comes, must he suffer many things and be rejected of this generation. So the day of the Son of Man will affect the entire planet, but that generation would reject him, right? So there is a day coming that Jesus will reign, but not in that generation. And time has told us that has been true, right? So we'll come back to Luke 17 in a few minutes, but let's get back to Matthew 24. Again, back to the Great Tribulation. Good.
I was just thinking about how they're trying to deceive the whole world, right?
Mhm.
And we talked before about technology, and he
Right.
can make himself known
To everyone, everywhere, all at once, right?
Yeah, so I can see where people would say, Jesus, Jesus said he would make himself
Yeah,
known.
check out the YouTube video, right? I mean, seriously, that's it. But you
Yeah.
see how technology can be used, right, to broadcast events in Jerusalem to the whole world. And we're going to talk more about that when it comes to the two witnesses, when it comes to the events that happen there. So the whole world is currently being set up, again, intentionally or unintentionally is irrelevant, for these events to take place. So then we get to Matthew 24. We're now looking at verse 29. We have now talking about what happens at the end of the tribulation. Again, look at the context. He just said there's a great tribulation coming. And now he says immediately after the tribulation of those days. So this is immediately following the great tribulation. Shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Mark 13, verse 24 and 25. But in those days, again, after the tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. Now, Luke 21 picks up where it has left off all these other issues. And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth. Wait a minute, I thought we were in the earth, right? But also on the earth, there's distress of nations. So not only are space and all the celestial beings falling apart, but the earth itself, there's distress of nations. Everyone's terrified with perplexity and the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Now let's go back to Revelation 6, verse 12. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll, when it rolled together, when every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every freeman, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and whom shall be able to stand? Yes.
So they understand
No,
that
sorry.
it's from God.
They recognize it's coming from God after the tribulation. These are after the tribulation, they make this recognition. When the sun, moon, and stars are darkened. So that was the events from Matthew and Mark. We know follow the great tribulation. That's immediately preceding the second coming. They recognize who he is. Yes, ma'am.
How does that fit in with Revelation 6, which is,
That was the sixth seal.
yeah.
So
I mean,
what do you mean?
Because you're, you said that's after the tribulation, but the sixth seal is not.
So how does the time go? So again, whenever you get to the sixth seal, right? And then you have the seventh seal, and you have this quietness in heaven. What happens immediately after that, right? We have the trumpets and the bowls or the vials. And all of that, again, when the Bible says there shall be time no more, a lot of different views on that. But for most people and how I feel about it, it means that all of these things are in rapid succession. That means all of the following events is Jesus pouring out his wrath on all that remain on the earth. And he brings great judgment on the earth. So I find the time, again, I can't tell you this is how many weeks this will happen till that happens, but I can tell you that the events of the first 3.5 years are kind of slow going, right? We have the first seal, the time of the Antichrist, and then those other three horsemen kind of following somewhere in the next 3.5 years. But these events, we're now down to probably the seventh year of this tribulation period, probably the end of the seventh year with the sixth seal. And I think that's whenever you get to the seventh seal where you have this final period of time leading into all these trumpets and vials. Okay. So that's how because again, Matthew and Mark tell us that when the sun goes dark, when the moon turns to blood, all these things, this has to happen after the tribulation, after the great tribulation of those days. So we're now at the end of whatever period of time, I believe to be 3.5 years of that great tribulation. And that's bringing it down to the finishing period of time before the return of Christ. So we remember, okay, that beginning no later than the fifth seal, right, with the killing of all of these people, the events of the great tribulation, right, they culminate, they complete with the powers of heaven being shaken, right, being disturbed and shaken. And again, the Olivet Discourse that we have in Matthew and Mark makes it very clear that the tribulation has occurred, or is at least finishing up and occurring, right? And we're at the tail end before the return of Christ. So the seventh seal, what happens with the seventh seal? Probably one of the most disturbing ones. There's silence in heaven, right? There's complete silence in heaven for half an hour. And then you get a fire-filled censer being cast to the earth, leading into the trumpets and the vials. So in Revelation chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, he says, when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of a half an hour. And no, sorry, that one would be in like the notes in between. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God. And I'll send you guys these updated ones, so you don't have to like jot all this stuff down. So I'll send you the updated notes. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God. So associated with the seventh seal is after this period of silence. And who knows what the silence is all about, but one, it's the terrible thing that's about to happen. You ever have something leave you speechless? I think it's partially related to that. To them were given 7 trumpets. Okay, so if we line all this up from the Olivet Discourse, so everything from seal 5 until the second coming wraps up the Great Tribulation, okay? But the tribulation itself, even though it's not part of the Great Tribulation, with the opening of the seals, happened from the first seal. So the book of Revelation is going to give us a lot more details regarding the Great Tribulation, right? So let's just go back to Luke 17, as I mentioned earlier. Talks about one little passage here from verse 35 to 37, says, 2 women shall be grinding together. The one shall be taken and the other left. 2 men shall be in the field. The one shall be taken and the other left. And they answered and said unto him, where, Lord? And he said unto them, whithersoever the body is, therefore will the eagles be gathered together. So there's going to be a judgment when Jesus returns. There's going to be a rapture, a collection of the wicked for judgment. There's going to be a time of the sheep and the goats, a judgment time when Jesus returns. So whenever we look at these passages in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Revelation, we're going to see the return of Christ. We're going to see a rapture of the elect, separate from the rapture of the church, and we're going to see a judgment of the wicked. Okay, there's going to be all those things. So let's go back to Matthew 24, verse 30 and 31. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So at the second coming, there's a rapture of the tribulation saints that have survived the tribulation, correct? Mark 13:26 says, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then shall he send his angels and shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds and from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. So not just the living, but all of them are going to be collected to him, right? So there's going to be some already in heaven. Luke 21, verse 27. And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now let's look at Jesus's return in Revelation.
What's that verse now for, we see we're looking for Jesus for the rapture, right?
Out of context, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, out of context, yes. Because again, all of these things. Now remember, Jesus tells you all these things in Luke, and then he says, oh, by the way, you can avoid all these things. So keep that in mind, right? These are for those who don't choose to accept Jesus Christ during this age of grace as we live in. So Revelation 19, verse 11, here's a description of them looking up and seeing Jesus come down. He says, and I saw heaven opened, and behold, now we have the real white horse, the 5th horseman of the apocalypse, right? Not the first, the 5th. He shows up, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood. And his name is called, we don't have to guess anymore, the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. Just so you know, I'm horse number 9,783,652. No, it'd be funny if I was, but no, I'm obviously being just kidding there. So the Olivet Discourse, right? Fast forwards through the Great Tribulation without all the details to the point where they see the sign of him coming, and then they see him coming, and they begin to mourn as he arrives to judge the earth. That's what Jesus, kind of gives them the brief on that, right? But again, here's that second rapture. So Jesus has arrived in judgment, and the elect are gathered by the angels sent across the heaven and the earth, right? But this is post-tribulational. We begin to understand here why some people say, look, there's clearly a post-tribulational rapture. And they're right. But just because there's a post-tribulational rapture doesn't mean there's not a pre-tribulational one. One does not exclude the other. This rapture is performed by who? The angels, right? The pre-tribulational rapture, who's that performed by? Jesus, we meet with him in the clouds, right? The post-tribulational rapture comes after a period of clear signs and things that happen. And it's a sign, it's time of immense troubles, immense suffering, persecution. But what about for the bride of Christ? What's the reward promised to the church of Philadelphia? Because you have kept the word of my patience, I will also keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon the whole world to try them that dwell on the earth. Could you imagine if that promise was trying to be applied to those that are still alive at his second coming? They weren't kept from the hour of temptation. There's clearly a way to avoid it all, right? The tribulation saints, those who did not get raptured because they were not saved, right? But they get saved during the tribulation. They're brought to Jesus on the earth by the angels. The church from before was raptured to meet him in the air. That's just a few of the many differences between the two. So let's move on. So verse 32 of Matthew 24 says, now learn a parable of the fig tree, which when the branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Likewise ye, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Mark 13, verse 28. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When her branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So in like manner, when you shall see these things come to pass, know that it is nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be done. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Luke 21, and he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when you see these things come to pass, know that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. By the way, how much time on this earth do we spend studying things? We spend our entire lives. We go to college, we read books, we go to work, we become experts in our field, right? But all that's going to pass away. What's the only thing that's not going to pass away? The words of Christ. Maybe make sure you're focusing on the right things, right? So we have a parable given here in the midst of this conversation that Jesus is having with these four disciples regarding the second coming. He discusses all the events of the tribulation leading up to his return. But then he says, you got to pay attention to the fig tree and really all the trees, right? When you see one of these events happening, look for all of them to happen, because it's all going to happen in one generation of people, right? What does that tell you? How long is the tribulation going to be? Some people believe we've been living it for the last 2,000 years. People believe that, oh, this is just a long span of time. It's kind of hard to fit into one generation, isn't it? So again, there's all kinds of things. So what is the significance of the fig tree? Is there any significance at all? I'm not telling you there is. I'm giving you a couple different views. A fig tree in the Middle East is often used as a predictor of summer, okay? Because it can show its leaves a little early, right? You know that, okay, most likely the frost is done, the snow is done, whatever. So you could stop there and saying that, okay, when these signs happen, Jesus is returning. Now, some people take the view that there's a lot more under the surface of the fig tree. So there's an interesting cross-reference to Song of Solomon, chapter 2. Okay. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, there's this discussion of a period of time after the winter, after the rain is gone, and the fig tree brings forth its figs, right? I believe that Song of Solomon, chapter 2, is prophetic. Okay. I believe it has to do with the return of Christ. So in Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 8, says, the voice of my beloved, behold, he cometh leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. My beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he standeth behind our wall. He looketh forth at the windows, showing himself through the lattice. Somebody who loves Jesus is on the lookout for his return. He looks for him coming down the hill. She sees him through the lattice, right? It says, my beloved spoke and said unto me, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. What does that sound like? Jesus saying, come on, we got somewhere to be. So the bride is permanently awaiting her love to return. She can hear his voice. He's coming from the mountains. He's coming through the hills. There's signs of his return everywhere. And she's like, oh my gosh, he's coming. And everyone else is like, you're nuts, right? It's like, no, he's coming. And he's there through the garden from the windows. And then he calls for her. Hey, come away. Come away from what? From the world. Again, that looks a whole lot like the rapture to me. Verse 11 of Song of Solomon 2. For lo, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of the singing of birds is come. The voice of the turtle or turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. Wow, the earth, everything's changing on the earth, maybe for the better, right? But the beloved bride is called to come away during a time when the fig tree has put forth her figs, and the vineyard is giving forth grapes on the earth. Where is she taken? Did you have something? Oh, sorry. So he says in verse 14, "O my dove, thou art in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs. Let me see thy countenance." I'm going to hide you somewhere where only I can see you. "Let me hear thy voice, for sweet is thy voice, and thy countenance is comely." You are beautiful. She's taken to a safe place in the clefts of the rock, the secret place where she can spend time with her beloved, where he can behold her beauty, right? She can hear his voice, enjoy his company. And while she's there enjoying him, what about all the beautiful fig trees and vineyards that were left behind? Well, verse 15 continues. "Take us the little foxes. The little foxes, they spoil the vines." You couldn't keep baby foxes out from the gardens because they could sneak in almost anywhere, right? They were destroying the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. All the gardens are falling apart, right? Disaster is coming to their area. "But my beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies." Until when? When is he going to go back? "Until the day break." So the morning has come, "and the shadows flee away. Turn, my beloved, and be thou like a roe or a young hart on the mountains of Bether." You know, Jesus has talked about being the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness. And he's going to come with healing in his wings or with a burning judgment. So until that day breaks, he's going to be there with his beloved. So while the bridegroom and the bride, that's from Malachi chapter 4, the bridegroom and his bride are enjoying each other in safety, the fig tree and the vineyard are being destroyed by the little foxes. Shadows are coming in the land until the bridegroom returns, till the day breaks. Do you see the picture of the rapture of the church right in there? Do you see the picture of spending time with Christ as the world falls apart, right? So again, the vineyard of who? Who's the vineyard of God? Well, in a lot of ways, it's Israel, right? So again, not everyone sees the parallels, but I think it seems pretty clear. Now, biblically, a fig tree is a sign of peace and prosperity. So in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 25, says, "And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and from Dan to Beersheba all the days of Solomon." So if you had a fig tree, you're living in peace, right? In Micah chapter 4, verse 4, "But every man shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it." In Zechariah chapter 3, verse 10, "In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, you shall call every man his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree." Figs, additionally, were used as medicine, okay? Remember Hezekiah, he had a problem on a boil. So it says in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 7, Isaiah said, "Take a lump of figs," and they took it and laid it upon the boil, and he recovered. It can be a sign of healing and recovery. So figs, again, they're a little unique because you can actually sometimes see the fruit before the leaves. They don't always have the leaves first. So the tender shoots that gives off, right, they tend to grow into the fruit. And it's one of the first signs that summer is here. So if you arrived at a fig tree prior to the time of the harvest of the figs, right, you could still see a bunch of fruit. Even though it takes them a long time to mature, you can see a lot of fruit on the fig tree. I mean, obviously there's different breeds of fig trees, but we're talking about Middle Eastern figs here. So a few chapters earlier in Matthew, Jesus had something to say about a fig tree that he went to and didn't find any fruit on it. So in Matthew 21, verse 18, it says, "Now in the morning, as he returned to the city, he hungered. And when he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it and found nothing thereon, but leaves only. That's abnormal for a fig tree. And he said unto it, let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how soon is the fig tree withered away? And Jesus answered and said unto them, verily I say unto you, if you have faith and doubt not, you shall not only do that which is done to the fig tree, but also if you shall say to this mountain, be thou removed and cast into the sea, it shall be done. And these things, whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Now, the same story, why am I bringing it up here? The same story is found in Mark, but more details are given in Mark regarding the surrounding events, why he had this fig tree right in the middle of the story. In Mark, we look at the timeline of the fig tree's cursing. In Mark chapter 11, verse 12 to 14, Jesus tries to find the food on the fig tree because it's barren, and he curses it. And of course, it withers, but they don't notice it immediately. They notice it withered the next day. In Mark chapter 11, verse 15 to 19, immediately after cursing the fig tree, Jesus goes to the temple and finds it corrupted. He finds all these money changers selling and buying and spending all this money, and he drives them out. He's very upset about that, right? Then we go to verse 20, where they go back to the fig tree, and Peter recognizes that the tree is completely withered, bottom to top, okay? And Jesus tells him, hey, you're going to see much greater things if you have faith, right? He talked about what we talked about in Matthew. So the picture of the fig tree sandwiched what he saw in the temple, a fruitless temple, right? He went to the fig tree, couldn't find any fruit, and cursed it. And he went to the temple, couldn't find any fruit, and drove everyone out. Go ahead,
Did
Tim.
you say that fig tree is, was he like referenced, Pharisees and?
I think he was referencing Israel as a nation of priests. They were failing to spread the word of God. They turned it all into financial gain, and that would include the Pharisees. So then he comes back, and then he tells them, hey, he said, the fig tree's withered. He's like, oh, but if you have faith, right? So can faith restore the fig tree? That's the question. Can Israel, as a picture of the fig tree, be restored? And I can tell you on the authority of biblical prophecy, it can, right? It certainly can. So again, we compare all that to the temple. Everyone's very impressed with how it looks. That's how this whole conversation started. Look at all the stones, look at all the precious jewels, all this stuff. And Jesus found no fruit there, right? He overturned everything. He had looked on the fig tree of Israel and said, there's no fruit, and it would wither away. And then what did he do after? He mourned, he cried over Jerusalem, right? He says, I wish that you would have me, but you won't, right? How many times I wanted to gather you like a hen gathers her chickens, right? But he said, no, not a single stone will be left upon another. So there's a lot of similarities between the temple and the fig tree. Both were told they would not bear fruit, yet one was told that they have a chance at redemption. When you shall say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, right? Then he'll return unto them. They could be restored. So symbolically, the withered fig tree of the temple can be restored when they turn back to Christ. So the Jewish people who were full of those who claimed devotion to God, but they had no fruit. As we say, talk is cheap, right? Where's your faith? So in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 8, but that which beareth thorns and briars is rejected, and is nigh unto cursing, whose end is to be burned. So because of these extreme parallels, there are a lot of parallels here. Many have assumed, and I'm not saying it's correct or incorrect, I do not know, that the return of the Jewish people to Israel, right? The time when Israel was restored in 1948 started the timeline of a generation, which may mean that all of the things, including the Great Tribulation, would be within 80 years of that event. 100 years, people have different views of a generation. I'm not saying I agree with that because I think it has more to do with the temple. Go ahead.
100 years.
What's that?
100 years.
100 years. Well, again, some people have different views on that because whenever you look at the generations of Egypt, how many generations were there? There'd be 4 generations. That was 400 years. When you get to the book of Revelation, it says, what is the age of it? What is the length of a man's days? 70 years, or by strength, 80 years. So there's all different views on what a generation means. But yeah, so it could be up to 100, could be less. But also, what is the timeline that starts it all? Is that fig tree the temple, or is it the nation of Israel? Again, these are numbers we're not meant to know. Our job is to be prepared and share the gospel with the world, right? So again, some people say it might be when Jerusalem becomes the capital, right? Is recognized as the capital, not Tel Aviv, which it currently is. Others say it's only when the temple is dedicated. Again, these are all possibilities. We just don't know. But the fact is, it doesn't matter. Many of these things have already happened. Other things could happen next week, right? So in Hosea chapter 9, verse 10, he says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time, but they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves unto the shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. In Hosea chapter 9, verse 16 says, Ephraim is smitten. Their root is dried up, and they shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth, yet will I slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. My God will cast them away, because they did not hearken unto him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. You see how he's comparing them to a tree whose root is withered? Again, just think of the parallels. Hosea chapter 11, verse 8, how shall I give thee up? Jesus is not happy of what's happening to Israel, right? He's not happy to see them in judgment. He's not happy to see anyone lost, not just Israel. But he says here, you hear the pain in his voice. How shall I give thee up, Ephraim? How shall I deliver thee, Israel? How shall I make thee as Admah? How shall I set thee as Zeboim? My heart is turned within me. It is tearing him apart to see so many lost. My repentings are kindled together. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of thee, and I will not enter into the city. So the fig tree of Israel will bloom again. And it appears to be happening before our very eyes, right? How close is the tribulation? I don't think it's very far at all. I'm not a date setter. God knows the date and time, not me. But it could happen at any time. We'll stop there. We'll pick up next time in Matthew 24, verse 36, Mark 13, 32, and Luke 21, 34. Any final thoughts or questions on anything we covered? All right. Well, Serena, anything from you?